Hi everyone, and welcome to class. We're still 6A. We're just finishing the first part of Class Struggles in France, part one. And we're going to have Bill and George is going to finish, and Liz has got some slides as well. So let's squeeze all that in. There you go, Bill.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Bill Jeffries. People don't know me. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap because some people weren't here last week. Okay, so what my presentation is essentially a summary of the first part of the class struggles in France, right? So essentially it goes up to June, whenever it was, 1848. So that's the first part that I'm going to deal with. Yeah. Um, and also, therefore, it's a selection. Okay. So I'm not saying the parts that I've selected are necessarily the best. There are other parts that are also great. In fact, the journalism is kind of fantastic, I think. So if you do want to bring in other parts or you think I've missed out something important, then of course that's fine, right? Okay. Uh, so I'll just get my slides up. Okay, so here we go. Right, so I'm going to go through the first part quite quickly and then I'll go through the second part in a little bit more detail, yeah? So this is originally from the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 1850. So that's another thing to bear in mind. This is kind of written live, if you will. So it's kind of, that's an interesting aspect of the writing. It's very, therefore, vivid, I think. And this is essentially Marx's description of the revolutions of 1848 to 1850. So he starts off by saying the key thing is that we're learning about the defeat of the revolution, as I said last week. So what's the defeat of the revolution that he's talking about? He's talking about the proletarian revolution, right? So this is because, as he points out, the bourgeoisie, for them, they win the fruits of the revolution, but the working class certainly don't. They lose it. So the question is two things. First of all, how did they lose? He wants to describe, and then how does it prepare, as he sees it, the next stage of the revolution, which was to come, in fact, in 1870, which he talks about in the Civil War in France. There's also lots of analogies you can draw between this and the 1917 revolution, February to October. And indeed, the Russian revolutionaries, of course, did draw lots of analogies from this revolution to other revolutions, 1905. I mean, it does remind me a lot, if people have read Trotsky's book, 1905. This reminds, I think that's the kind of closest other book to this, which is very, very similar. And he says the point is the Revolutionary Party before the French Revolution was not free, from which it could be freed not by the victory of February, but only by a series of defeats. So the working class had to learn through the defeat of the revolution how to take power, so to speak. Right? Okay. Now, so the other thing is that in this first section, which I'll very quickly summarize because we talked about it last week, he describes the context of the revolution. There's various different factors. So you could say there's kind of a social political context, which was the legacy of the 1830 revolution, which put the financial aristocracy in power. Right. So he describes how the financial aristocracy were in power. In other words, the industrial bourgeoisie were not in power. This is the key point to emphasize. So the industrial bourgeoisie were excluded from power by the 1830 revolution. So this is a very important point because you have a split in the bourgeoisie between the financial aristocracy and the industrial bourgeoisie. So this kind of creates room for society. So one of the issues is how does the revolution propel the industrial bourgeoisie into power? And then he describes how, the other people who are excluded from power is the petty bourgeoisie, the so-called men of talent, as he calls them. There's still plenty of those around at the moment. So this is the petty bourgeoisie. Now he differentiates here with the petty bourgeoisie from the peasantry, the farmers, the small farmers, which make up the majority of the French population at this time. And you could view them, if you want, as petty bourgeois in a sense, as an intermediate class. But he's describing really the kind of the urban privileged layers and shopkeepers, journalists, people like that. John.
Yeah, we did point out last week that the peasantry and the farmers are two separate classes of people in France in this period.
Well, you could say that, but I mean, Engels, go on.
Well, no, the problem is, if you're writing in German, they don't have distinct words for farmers and peasants. They're Bauer. It's the same thing. So but the farmers are in fact in this well, in fact now, strictly speaking, they are capitalists investing in their profiteering. The peasantry have got their own land and they're trying to be their aim is to be self-sufficient. They can't be. They've got to buy something. So that means they've got to sell something, whatever. But the farmers and the peasants are separate. And peasants were originally working land belonging to the aristocracy. They got the land as part of the 1789 revolution. And they work as a class rather different. I mean, we'll see this particularly when we get to the 18th Brumaire, where Marx talks about the peasantry in a lot more detail, in a lot more analytical detail, perhaps. But they're not the same as farmers anyway. Let's get it. Farmers are part of the petty bourgeoisie.
Well, they could. I mean, anyway, your point is well made. So the peasantry is stratified. This is the key point to make. So you have at the top, obviously, farmers who are rich farmers, capitalist farmers, in other words, who employ other rural workers to work for them. And then you go through different stratifications from very rich capitalist farmers / aristocrats down to the rural poor, if you want to put it like that. Yeah. Wiley. No problem. Okay, so if Wiley wants to speak, obviously he can in a minute. Okay, so that's another interesting point. Okay, so we have a very stratified farming population, yeah, and then you have as well.
Bill, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go on, Wiley. Yeah.
But I want a clarification. You indicated I had a little different interpretation of that passage. Somewhere in there, and I can't look at it because of a vision problem, Marx makes the point that the petty bourgeois was excluded from political power. Okay? And I don't think he equates, I didn't interpret him equating the men of talent to the petty bourgeoisie. I looked at them more as agents and flunkies for the classes in power as adjuncts or supporters of those classes rather than a class for, in itself, rather than the petty bourgeois. I think he was quite explicit in saying that, and I thought about that. I said, well, how could that be that the petty bourgeoisie as a class, urban and rural, were excluded from political power? But you seem to be saying here that they weren't, but that they were represented by the so-called men of talent.
I think you make a fair point, actually. If you look at the quote, and I think it's a fair point. So he says the petty bourgeoisie of all gradations and the peasantry also were completely excluded from political power. Right. Finally, in the official opposition or entirely outside the pays légaux, there were ideological representatives and spokespersons of the above classes, their savants, lawyers, doctors, etc. In a word, the so-called men of talent. So I think that's a fair point. So you could say they were not strictly speaking petty bourgeoisie, but they did nonetheless speak for them.
Yeah, and the reason why I emphasize that point is because that's a very serious problem for us today. This whole question of the professional managerial class and all these other gradations, which well, at least in the United States, made a big deal of, right? Situating those folks is, in terms of a class analysis, is an important question. So that's why I raised it in that sense.
No, fair point. Okay, so we have this kind of situation in society, the legacy of the 1830 revolution, the different classes that existed, the tensions between them. And then also you have, he points out there's some conjunctural kind of, and that, so the key point about the financial aristocracy is that they essentially loot the state, right? So I mean, there's parallels obviously to Trump's big beautiful bill, that who benefits from the indebtedness. Yeah, so in other words, the people who own the debt, don't they? So indebtedness is not just a negative. If you own the debt, obviously that's an asset, right? So part of the other context is as well is that you have this indebtedness because of the financial aristocracy. So there's a key question is who owns the debt? And then the fact that you have to repay this debt becomes a big issue, right? Okay, so that's also a key point. So he talks about this, and therefore because they benefited from the state. It's like the Labour Party in Britain. The Labour Party in Britain essentially loots the state. That's how they get their financial privileges. So unlike the Tories, in Britain we have two parties. Well, we used to have two parties, now it's all fallen to bits. But you'd have the actual ruling class and then the people who wanted to rule on behalf of the ruling class, which is the Labour Party. So they don't inherit their wealth. They get their wealth from managing the state on behalf of the capitalists, if you will. But you can see that they have an interest in it. So there's lots of parallels you can draw. So one of the key issues was corruption. Also, there was, some defeats in wars and some uprisings going on. And then finally, there was, he says, the mood of revolt ripened by two economic world events, the potato blight and the commercial and industrial crisis in England, right? So there's a big recession in England. Now, remember, this is important because England at this time was half of world industrial production, if not more, was in England. So at this point, Britain really was the preeminent capitalist power. It produced, the vast bulk of the world's steel was produced in England. However, I mean, you could put that in perspective. Every 2 years, China produces more steel now than Britain has ever produced. So every 2 years, China produces more steel than Britain produced since the Industrial Revolution. So it tells you there wasn't much steel being produced in 1850. Yeah. However, what steel was being produced, or iron, was being produced by Britain overwhelmingly. But there was a big general commercial industrial crisis in England. So this is the business cycle, which most people, when I say most people, from the Second International, they say the business cycle started in about 1825. So if you think, recurring 8 to 10 year cycle, this cycle broke out in 1848. Okay. All right. So this is the kind of context to it. And there's a great deal of discontent, which because they banned political protests, they did a banquet thing for electoral reform. And then there was an uprising and a provisional government emerged. So this is the kind of February Revolution. And then out of this kind of upheaval, the bourgeoisie take power, and they include some representatives of the working class who they put in charge of a particular ministry, but this ministry has no money. It has no power. It has no lawmaking abilities, but it does run some workshops. So one of the big issues is who pays for this. So the bourgeoisie will allow the proletariat the right to fight for its interests. Yeah. So there's an alliance between the industrial bourgeoisie and the working class, insofar as the working class is fighting for the common interests of them both. Yeah, Cynthia. Muted.
Okay, I'm not muted anymore. Okay. Well, what struck me about that atelier or the work, the commission for work, was that it arose from the demand of the workers, the proletariat of Paris, that they wanted work. And I mean, there's lots of things to draw from that. One, that is the stage of development that things were in, where wanting work was the proletariat's call. The other is how often the proletariat makes calls that are not in its own interest. I mean, that is, ends up being in the interest of the bourgeoisie. So to me, that was one of the more interesting points of this whole of what we're reading right now, is that, the irony of how the other thing is how clearly it relates to the welfare economics of the US. That is, maybe you'll be going into this later, but where it's discredited because it is just make work, dig holes, fill them up, and so a form of welfare, which is such a prominent political trope in the US, right? Don't give people something who don't deserve it. Anyway, just
good point. So out of this revolution then, so there's a few consequences of the revolution. First of all, the industrial bourgeoisie get into power. Now, they don't kick the financial aristocracy out of power, but they share it with them. So you have this thing. Right. The second thing is they're forced to get rid of the constitutional monarchy. So that they want to try and keep the constitutional monarchy, but eventually they have to get rid of it because they're pushed to do so by the working class. Raspail betook himself to the Hotel de Ville and said if you didn't proclaim a republic, he would return at the head of 200,000 men. So the bourgeoisie are forced to get rid of the constitutional monarchy. And then, however, they proclaim République Française, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. So then this is this uneasy settlement now in the context of the provisional government. So essentially what's that? The bourgeoisie need to demobilize the working class and consolidate their rule, right? So now out of this uprising, we have a new settlement. Now the industrial bourgeoisie in power, but the working class are not yet demobilized, right? So this is very, very risky, very, very dangerous for the bourgeoisie, because the working class could start to impose their own demands on the situation, right? This was the inspiration, obviously, for permanent revolution, Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution. So this is a very, very risky situation. Once the working class are a social force capable of presenting their own interests, for the bourgeoisie, that's a very, very dangerous situation. So the bourgeoisie need to demobilize the working class and consolidate their own power. And this is what they essentially do. And this is the story of what happens next. How do they impose their rule, reimpose their rule in this context? Okay. And then he says the working class come into society, and they act as one person upon the pro-revolutionary stage. One was the terrain to fight for its revolutionary emancipation, but by no means this emancipation itself. So the working class had made important gains in terms of constituting itself as a class and removing barriers to democratic rights, etc., but it had not emancipated itself. And one of the key issues is that it thought it had, right? Because it projected, well, a lot of working class projected their own interests onto the provisional government, as we shall see. So that they thought they'd actually freed themselves, but of course, Marx points out they hadn't, because essentially this was the provisional government was the rule of capitalists. Okay, so the first thing the French Republic had to do was rather to complete the rule of the bourgeoisie, but by allowing, besides the financial aristocracy, all the property classes to enter the orbit of political power. And therefore they had to allow all of the bourgeois classes to enter and stop everyone else from participating, right? Including the petty bourgeoisie, the peasantry, and the workers. So how did they do that? Now, they were against getting rid of the constitutional monarchy, since it struck off the crown behind which capital had kept itself concealed. So from the point of view of they prefer to have a constitutional monarchy because they can rule behind the monarchy, right? So that, I mean, in Britain they still do it, right? So we still have our king. Unbelievable. I mean, when they say British citizens, they should really say British serfs, shouldn't they? We're still subjects of the crown. It annoys me when they'll say British citizens. There's no such thing as a British citizen. There's a British subject, right? But anyway, whatever. So we still in Britain have that settlement. Okay. All right. So we have this provisional government, and within it we have the Special Ministry of Labour, which was at Luxembourg Palace, which included Louis Blanc and Albert. And it became what Marx calls disparagingly a socialist synagogue, whose high priests were Louis Blanc and Albert. Okay. Unlike any profane state power, they had no budget, no executive, no authority at their disposal. They were supposed to break the pillars of bourgeois society by dashing their heads against them, right? So, yeah, I mean, they're on a hiding to nothing, in other words, right? But it kind of reflects, I mean, this is a telling point, I think. He says, a nation has the leadership it deserves, doesn't it? And, you know, this limitation reflected where the consciousness of the working class was at. You know, it didn't yet understand it had to impose its own interest on society, and so it reflected its inadequate consciousness. Yeah, Wiley, go.
Yeah, you basically said what I wanted to say, namely that it reflected the level of development of working class consciousness. But another important factor is what objectively determines the limits of that consciousness, namely the level of development of the productive forces and the working class and relationships corresponding to that. I mean, we're not talking about a highly organized industrial proletariat, are we here? We're talking about a bit of a transition to that. And I think, I mean, to me, this is a very important point because it gets us away from this thing of attributing to a certain class a certain insight and understanding, and turns it into a conspiracy rather than an objective process, because the consciousness of the bourgeoisie itself was also limited by the same factors, namely the level of development of the productive forces and what was capable in terms of, you know, being able to solve the problems presented at that time. So I thought this discussion was extremely important, but the observation that you made was the one that I really wanted to make. Okay. Good.
Okay, cool. Good. Okay, so moving on. I'll try and speed up a little bit. Okay, so and as he points out, the development of the industrial proletariat is in general conditioned by the development of the industrial bourgeoisie. This is as I mentioned last week, I still think it's relevant. Have we missed our chance? It makes me wonder, because we did have an industrial proletariat. Certainly in Britain, we haven't got one anymore. Anyway, whatever. So under its own only under its rule does the proletariat, this is the rule of the industrial bourgeoisie, does the proletariat gain the extensive national existence which can raise its revolution to a national one, and only thus does the prolet itself create the modern means of production which become just as so many means of its revolutionary emancipation. Okay. The industrial bourgeoisie can rule only where modern industry shapes all properly relations to suit itself, and the industry can win the power only when it has conquered the world market, for national bounds are inadequate for its development, right? So as a kind of prediction of the future, that's obviously correct. So, and he says, the struggle against capital in its developed modern form, in its decisive fate, the struggle of the industrial wage worker against the industrial bourgeoisie is, in France, a partial phenomenon, he says, at this stage. And therefore, the red flag was lowered to the tricolour. And that they could understand their situation. The workers could, by this victory, this is the victory of consciousness, of understanding where they were in society, only through the tremendous defeat in June. Okay, so he views this as a kind of learning experience for the workers. Right then. So, and then what we see is that that essentially then the process unwinds. How did the bourgeoisie? So remember, the task of the bourgeoisie is to consolidate its power and therefore remove the power of the other classes. So the question is, how did it do it? So the Luxembourg Commission, this creation of Paris, must be given the credit for having disclosed from a Europe-wide tribune the secret of the revolution in the 19th century, the emancipation of the proletariat. So the workers could only be free, only have achieved the goals of the Luxembourg Commission if they'd actually taken power in society. They couldn't have this kind of half-baked situation. So, therefore, in the minds of the proletarians who confused the financial aristocracy, the bourgeoisie in general, the rule of the bourgeoisie was abolished with the introduction of the Republic. At that time, all the royalists were transformed into republicans and all the millionaires of Paris into workers. The Paris proletariat revelled in this magnanimous intoxication of fraternity. So workers thought that because they'd deposed the financial aristocracy, they'd in fact deposed the capitalists, but in fact they hadn't. They'd only deposed one fraction of the capitalists and put another fraction into power. And they, you know, people are forgiving, aren't they? They're happy they have a revolution, uprising. I'm sure we've all been in situations like that. But in fact, you're tapping people on the back who really are not on your side at all. Okay, Jeff.
Just a historical point. There's a lot of missing things here from the French Revolution. And the Luxembourg Commission here seems to fulfill the role played by the Paris Commune in 1792.
Yeah.
But where the Paris Commune had power, which it manifested, as Albert Soboul showed, through a series of forays invading the National Assembly from the poorer Paris sections. Here, the Luxembourg Commission doesn't embody power, and there is no Paris Commune.
No, that's very true.
The reason they got rid of the constitutional monarchy as they did was because Republicans, the Jacobins in France, had succeeded in 1830 in overthrowing the monarchy. They expected a republic to come then, and they were conned. So they're resorting once again to the old French Revolution of getting your way through direct action of the local committees.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is true. And what's very fascinating, obviously, about the French history, really, over this 100 years, is that you have these revolutions and you can see how they repeat themselves over and over again. And they go further and further and further in some respects, in other respects, not so far. Yeah, so absolutely, the analogies with 1789 and obviously also 1870 are very, very pertinent. Okay. So let's just carry on. So, right, so the provisional government, for its part, once it was compelled to proclaim the Republic, did everything in its did everything to make it acceptable to the bourgeoisie and the provinces. The bloody terror of the First French Republic was disavowed by the abolition of the death penalty for political offences. The bourgeois republicans of the National amused themselves by exchanging monarchist names and costumes for old republican ones, right? So, in other words, they just put on new hats, new clothes, at slightly different dinners, and then they celebrated the Republic instead of the monarchy. But apart from that, it didn't make any difference. The Republic, its task was no longer the revolutionary transformation of the world, but consisted only adapting itself to the relations of bourgeois society. As to the fanaticism with which provisional government undertook this task, there is no more eloquent testimony than its financial measures. So this is the key point. If once the provisional government is put into power by the people, if it rules on behalf of the capitalists, then it has to take measures against the people, which then disillusion the people with the provisional government. And therefore, because they identify the provisional government with the revolution, they disillusion the people with the revolution as well, right? So this is a paradoxical situation, that as the provisional government embodies the revolution, but the provisional government actually rules on behalf of the bourgeoisie, as it takes steps to consolidate the power of the bourgeoisie, so it erodes the popular basis of its own support, right? So you have this paradoxical situation going on. And so what do? Well, he points out that public credit and private credit rest on confidence, so you needed to restore confidence in public debt. So how did they do that? So in order to allay the very suspicion that it would not or could not honour the obligations assumed by the monarchy, in advance of the legal date of payment, it paid out the interest on the 5%, 4.5%, and 4% bonds to the state creditors. Okay, so it actually rewarded it met the debts that had been incurred by the monarchy under the Republic in order to show that it was good. Now, obviously, if you're a revolutionary government, what you should have done, or if it had been a real dictatorship project, you scrub out the debts, don't you? Because they're incurred under the monarchy. But this is therefore that's a wholly different policy. And then, so what did it do then? Well, so it promised to pay out all of these loans early. So where did it get the money from? Was the issue. So it got the money from poor savers or the lower middle classes and the peasantry. Yeah, so that they were the two places that it got the money from. So it announced that no more money could be drawn on saving bank books for an amount of over 100 francs. So the middle classes started to see that they couldn't withdraw their savings. The sums deposited in the savings banks were confiscated and by decree transformed into an irredeemable state debt. This embittered the already hard-pressed petty bourgeoisie against the Republic. Okay, so you reward the financial aristocracy. How do you pay for it? You take the savings of the petty bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie identify the revolution as taking their savings, therefore they join the counter-revolution. Yeah? Okay. So the capitalists did that, and then so the provisional government fixed a compulsory quotation for the notes of the bank. The provisional government was writhing under the incubus of a growing deficit. In vain it begged for patriotic sacrifices. Who was sacrificed to bourgeois credit? Jacques Le Bonhomme, the peasant. Okay, so they sacrificed the savings of the petty bourgeoisie, and then they sacrificed the peasantry, which is the vast bulk of French society at this point. And how did they do that? They imposed an additional tax of 45 centimes in the franc on the 4 direct taxes. So obviously it's 100 centimes. That's right, isn't it? And so 45 is 45% tax, which is a bit of a swinging tax. Yeah. So they put this huge tax on the peasantry. So first of all, you alienate the petty bourgeoisie, then you alienate the peasantry, right? So and then how do they then say, well, who's benefiting, they say, from the provisional government? The workers are, through the Luxembourg Commission. So whose fault is it that there's this 45% tax on the peasantry, it's the workers' fault, right? So then you lose the final bastion of support. So you lose the petty bourgeoisie, you lose the peasantry, and you lose the working class as well. So, yeah, and he contrasts this with the revolution of 1789, when, of course, they expropriated the landlords and gave them their land, the aristocracy and the church, they gave their land to the farmers. So the farmers were better off, and therefore they supported the revolution. But in this case, the farmers were worse off, and therefore they supported the counter-revolution. Yeah. So the emancipation of the workers, even as a phrase, became an unbearable danger to the new republic, for it was standing protest against the restoration of credit, which rests on the undisturbed and untroubled recognition of the existing economic class relations. Therefore, it was necessary to have done with the workers, right? Okay, so you've got rid of the petty bourgeoisie, you've got rid of the farmers, now you have to get done with the workers. Okay, Wiley.
I just have a question. When I read that, all it exposed to me was my ignorance of French history and the Revolution. But it made me think of how extensive was that concession to the farmer, to the peasantry coming out of the first French Revolution. Was that land distribution from the landed aristocracy to the peasant huge? That is, did it lay the economic basis for that large, small proprietor population in France subsequent to the First French Revolution? That's just a question I have. Does anybody?
Yeah, I mean, basically, yes, it did. So there was a huge land redistribution. Right. Obviously, lots of it was bought by new financial aristocrats, the aristocrats, the bourgeoisie, but a lot did go to small farmers as well, an awful lot. Okay, so yeah, that was the contrast with 1789. Okay, so what? How did they? So they have to then get rid of the working class, because the question is that as long as the workers are there, they pose a potential threat to the rule of the capitalists, right? So how do you get rid of them? First of all, you need an armed force, a state, to threaten them. So what do? You have to. The consequently remain but one way out to play off part of the proletariat against the other, right? So that what they do is they arm what Marx calls the lumpen proletariat, meaning the urban poor, right? And they put them into an armed body called the Mobile Guards, each 1,000 strong, composed of young men from 15 to 20 years old. They belong for the most part to the lumpen proletariat, which in all big towns forms a mass sharply differentiate from the industrial proletariat, a recruiting ground for thieves and criminals of all kinds, living on the crumbs of society, people without a definite trade, vagabonds, gens sans feu et sans aveu. What does that mean, Herbert? People without a fire and without futures. Avenir. How is it? Avenir. Yeah, so people without a present and without a future, I suppose you could say, would be my bad French translation, right? So they live from the moment, from hand to mouth, you could say, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. So, and the French proletariat was confronted with this army, and they thought it was a proletarian guard. So they thought it was representing the people, because they thought that the provisional government represented the people. And this was not an army like previous armies. This was an army drawn from the poorest sections of urban society, and therefore people identified with it. Okay, so they got that all wrong. So besides the Mobile Guard, the government decided to rally around itself an army of industrial workers, 100,000 workers thrown on the streets by the crisis and the revolution, were enrolled by the Minister Marie in so-called national ateliers. The provisional government believed that it had formed in them the second proletarian army against the workers themselves. This time the bourgeois were mistaken in the national ateliers, just as the workers were mistaken in the Mobile Guard. It created an army for mutiny. So it also, as well as the Mobile Guard, it created workers' ateliers or workshops, whatever you want to call it, for public works, right? So, in their appellation, though not in their, by their name, but not their content, the National Ateliers were the embodied protest of the proletariat against bourgeoisie industry, bourgeois credit, and the bourgeois republic. Now, and therefore, it says the whole hate of the bourgeoisie was therefore turned upon them. It found in them simultaneously the point against which it could direct the attack as soon as it was strong enough to break openly with the February illusions. All the discontent, all the ill humor of the petty bourgeois too was directed against these national ateliers, the common target. With real fury, they totted up the money the proletarians' loafers swallowed up, while their own situation was becoming daily more unbearable. A state pension for sham labour, so that's socialism, they grumbled to themselves, right? So because the national government is ruling on behalf of the bourgeoisie, it, as we said, it expropriates the savings of the petty bourgeoisie, it taxes the peasants to pay for what? The national ateliers, the working class, and therefore it turns the classes who should be supporting the revolution against the revolution. Yeah, there you go. Kayo, sorry if that's go for it.
Yeah, that's correct. That's how I pronounce it. Don't worry. I think that Emma's comment, it's something I would like to emphasize, because if we take the definition of lumpen proletariat that Marx gives us in the 18th Brumaire, it points not to a social condition, but more to sort of a moral situation. And then if we look at the quote you all brought last week, we have the lumpen proletariat in the highest, highest fractions of industry, and the highest fractions of financial bourgeoisie. So it's not about being poor, it's a moral condition as far as I can reach, especially the one that seeks for wealth without working for it, even if working means exploiting for it. But when you have got the financial bourgeoisie, it lends money and takes income from that. And so that's a point. That's an interesting category because it might help to explain Trump's election in the United States, Bolsonaro's election in Brazil, and lots and lots and lots and lots of different elections in different countries. It doesn't explain only in itself, but I think it helps to explain. Sorry, thank you.
No.
Sorry, I'm just unrusting my English. So sorry.
Your English is better than mine. Don't worry about it. So, yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I also think, however, that these are kind of a bit more descriptive categories rather than you don't get a category like in Capital where you have the commodity. It's a very scientific, fleshed out, well-defined category. I think these categories are more descriptive. I have more of a descriptive element in them as well, and this is part of the confusion. I think that they're used in different ways, and I mean, I accept what your point about the lumpen proletariat, not strictly speaking the urban poor. I mean, that's obviously true, but it's more of a descriptive category, I think, rather than a kind of very narrow, precise category, such as in Capital and you see elsewhere. Anyway, so good points there. Okay, so we're getting there. So so we see how these starting to turn away. Thus, in the approaching melee between the bourgeoisie and proletariat, all the advantages, all the decisive posts, all the middle strata of society were in the hands of the bourgeoisie. At the same time as the waves of the February Revolution rose high over the whole continent, and each new post brought a new bulletin of revolution, now from Italy, now from Germany, now from the remotest parts of southeastern Europe, and maintained a general ecstasy of the people, giving it constant testimony of the victory that it had already forfeited. March 17th and April 16th were the first skirmishes in the big class struggle which the bourgeois republic hit under its wing. And then he tells, so March the 17th. So there was a kind of, you can see again, if you think there's parallels, obviously, with the Russian Revolution, you have the July Days, which is a kind of abortive uprising of the Petrograd sailors. And then you have also the Kornilov coup, where the, you know, the whatever you want to call them, the revolutionaries side with the provisional government against the White Guard. So there's echoes of these later events in this revolution as well. So there's a kind of number of tests where the bourgeoisie are mobilizing the people against the working class. They're seeing how strong they are. So March 16th, the bourgeoisie represented in the National Guard staged a hostile demonstration against the provisional government. Down with Ledru-Rollin, it surged to the Hotel de Ville, that's the town hall. And so the people were forced on March 17th to shout, "Long live Ledru-Rollin, long live the provisional government." They were forced to take sides against the bourgeoisie in support of the bourgeois republic, which seemed to them to be in danger. Okay, so we have this paradoxical situation where the people identify the provisional government, which is ruling on behalf of the bourgeoisie, nonetheless with the revolution. So when the bourgeoisie mobilize against the provisional government, the people defend the provisional government against the bourgeoisie, right? So it's kind of very complex, but you see the same phenomena in the Russian Revolution with the kind of Kornilov coup, which threatened Kerensky's rule. April 16th was a misunderstanding engineered by the Provisional Government Alliance with the bourgeoisie. The workers had gathered in great numbers in the Champ de Mars and in the Hippodrome to choose their nominees to the General Staff of the National Guard. Suddenly, throughout Paris, from one end to another, a rumour spread as quick as lightning to the effect that the workers had met armed in the Champ de Mars under the leadership of Louis Blanqui, Cabet, and Raspail, in order to march thence on the Hotel de Ville, overthrow the provisional government, and proclaim a communist government. The general alarm is sounded. Ledru-Rollin, Marat, and Lamartine later contended for the honour of having initiated this, and in an hour, 100,000 men are under arms. Down with Louis Blanc, down with Blanqui, with Raspail, with Cabet. Okay, so this is again is a kind of a mythical, I suppose you could say, attempt similar to the July days, where the bourgeoisie mobilised against what they claimed was a communist uprising. Yeah, Wiley.
Yeah, I don't know where you're going to deal with it, but I decided to mention it. See, I think another clear and important element in this whole drama was the provisional government adoption of universal suffrage, and how that fact that's so advanced in terms of the ballot, the vote, was turned against the working class. Are you going to treat that, or is that something?
Yeah, that I've got that on my slides to come, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. We stop.
Yeah, no, but that, I mean, again, the again, you see parallels with the October Revolution, because there was an election held there, I think, in April, May, and the results came out in October. Which this is the big, you know, did Trotsky ignore the will of the people? Blah blah blah. But by then, the workers had already taken power, and so they said, obviously, we're not going to give power back to the capitalists just because there was a revolution. There was an election 6 months ago. That'd be ridiculous. Anyway, there we go. So we see all these different things. And then on May the 4th, the National Assembly met the result of the direct general elections convened. Right, so there was a general election going on. And so everyone pretends to be the even legitimists and Orleanists at first dared to show themselves only under the mask of bourgeois republican. The fight against the proletariat could be undertaken only in the name of the republic, right? So they remember, they were against having a republic, but now you have a republic, you have to campaign against the proletariat under the umbrella of the republic. The republic proclaimed by the National Assembly, the sole legitimate republic, is a republic which is no revolutionary weapon against the bourgeois order, but rather its political reconstitution, the political reconsolidation of bourgeois society, in a word, a bourgeois republic, right? And we, as he says, we've seen how it couldn't be anything but a bourgeois republic, how the provisional government nonetheless was forced by the immediate pressure of the proletariat to announce it as a republic with social institutions, how the Paris proletariat was still incapable of going beyond the bourgeois republic otherwise than in its fancy and its imagination, how even where the republic acted in the service of the bourgeoisie, when it really came to action, how the promises made to it became an unbearable danger for the new republic, how the whole life process of the provisional government was comprising a continuous fight against the demands of the proletariat. Okay, and so we're nearly there. The assembly broke immediately with the social illusions of the February Revolution. It roundly proclaimed the bourgeois republic nothing but the bourgeois republic. And the real birthplace of the bourgeois republic is not the February victory, it is the June defeat of the workers, right? The proletariat hastened the decision when on the 15th of May it pushed its way into the National Assembly, sought in vain to recapture its revolutionary influence, and only delivered its energetic leaders to the jailers of the bourgeoisie. The workers were directly provoked, insulted and derided from the tribune of the Constituent National Assembly, but the real point of the attack, as we have seen, was the National Italias. The Executive Commission began by making admission to the National Italias more difficult by turning a day wage into a peace wage by banishing workers not born in Paris to the Salon. The workers were left with no choice, so they began to attack the National Italias, and therefore they provoked an uprising by the workers. That was the whole point. They answered in June 22nd with a tremendous insurrection in which the first great battle was fought between the two classes that split, one say, it's a fight for the preservation or annihilation of the bourgeois order. The veil that shrouded the republic was torn asunder. It is well known how the workers were, with unexampled bravery and ingenuity, without leaders, without a common plan, without means, and for the most part lacking weapons, held in check for 5 days the Mobile Guard, the Parish National Guard, the National Guard that streamed in from the provinces. It is well known how the bourgeoisie compensated itself for mortal anguish it suffered by unheard of brutality, massacring over 3,000 prisoners. And then he points out the kind of hypocrisy of the terms like fraternity, which means fraternity for everyone except the workers. And then he says the February Revolution was a nice revolution of universal sympathies. The June Revolution is the ugly revolution, the nasty revolution, because the phrases have given place to the real thing, because the Republic has bared the head of the monster by knocking off the crown which shielded and concealed it. Now, I put this quote in because if you, I'm assuming you do remember, Rosa Luxemburg said order has been restored in one of her most famous articles in 1919, just before she was murdered. So she was obviously, my phone has gone mad, sorry. What the hell?
This is a test of emergency alerts. The UK government service.
It's the UK government giving us a nuclear warning. Palestine Action have taken power. No, anyway. Sorry, that's thrown me. That has totally thrown me. What the heck, man? Jesus, what? Anyway, sorry about that. That was the UK government that decided to blow my phone up. But anyway, okay, so, which is kind of appropriate, I suppose, at this point in the presentation. Anyway, yeah, Rosa Luxemburg, also one of her most famous articles in 1919, I think like 2 weeks before she was killed, wrote an article which paraphrases this next part. Order was Guizot's war cry. Order, shouted Sebastiani, the Guizotist. Order thundered his grape shot as it tore into the body of the proletariat. And she also wrote an article saying order has been restored, order, in one of her most famous articles. Anyway, so there we go. So they put down the June uprising in place of the demands, exuberant in form, but still limited and even bourgeois in content, whose concession the proletariat wanted to wring from the February Revolution. There appeared the bold slogan of revolutionary struggle: overthrow the bourgeoisie, dictatorship of the working class. We, under the red flag, we exclaim, the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. Okay. All right, so there you go. That's my little summary of the first part. So any questions, contributions, whatever. So Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for your introduction, Bill. One thing that gets me, everyone, non-Marxists, regard this as brilliant journalism. I was reading Theodore Zeldin, who is far from a Marxist, and he was talking about the brilliant journalism that Marx wrote on 1848 to 52. But when I read it, I was surprised by it. But it wasn't. There was an element of fantasy. First of all, journalism forces him to be sensitive to reality. He can't just take his theory and stick it on and obliterate everything that's not there. He's not that sort of writer anyway. But the other thing is that it's not the sort of journalism that we've come to expect in Britain. There's a book which has just appeared on the EU by a guy called Tom McTeague, the editor of the New Statesman. And that is journalism at its worst to me, even though it's written very well. It starts off with pages on the assassination of Admiral Darlan, whatever. That's got nothing to do with the EU, but it's certainly very exciting. But this journalism has no, it looks at the conjuncture of personalities and sees personalities bouncing off one another. Marx is looking at conjuncture, and it's not merely a description of conjunctures. The conjunctures are related to a theory. And the theory is of, at this time, in 1848, is determined by how far Marx has gone in his understanding of capitalism. Remember, he's a Ricardian socialist. He has not yet made the theoretical breakthroughs which he makes in the Grundrisse, even though he's very far advanced. So the theory is a theory that is already explicated in the Communist Manifesto, a theory of class struggle, which is related to the economic development of the economy of society. But this can lead to weaknesses here as well. I mean, the most startling is when Marx talks of May 16th as the proletariat entering the National Assembly. It wasn't the proletariat, it was a small group of socialists led by Blanqui. And Blanqui was outraged by the elections because the elections totally defeated the left, Jacobins, socialists, whatever. They were a total victory for conservatism. So Blanqui led a demonstration on the old lines of 1792, invaded the National Assembly because there was no support for him whatsoever. He was thrown out. But Blanqui was the one who stressed the dictatorship question. I always thought he talked about he was the one who invented the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, but apparently I've been told not. I've read, but I've yet to make that. But Blanqui is not the proletariat. And Marx is, in trying to stress class forces, quite rightly, because it is a social struggle that's taking place here, he's overdoing the pudding by not being very precise when he talks about the proletariat and all the rest. But it is theory. If you brought another theory like Angoulon, who talks about the importance of the localities as against Paris and looks at all the different districts of France in his book on the Revolution of 1848, or a Weberian, just talking about bankers is not enough. That's a social group. Everyone can understand that social groups are involved in struggle with one another, but you don't have to call them fractions of the bourgeoisie. For Marx to call them fractions of a bourgeoisie is because Marx got a theory of the bourgeoisie and its relationship to capitalism. He's much clearer than a lot of them, certainly much clearer than our present journalists who don't seem to have any theory whatsoever. But I think that the relation between theory and journalism is very important.
Yeah, thanks. Wiley.
Well, I see it a little differently. I don't think it's an imposition of theory onto reality that Jeff seems to be saying. I think on the series, it's the converse of that. That is, I take what he's saying here as a recapitulation of what actually happened and how it happened and the forces involved in that process being labeled in a certain way. But he was like, the proletariat is not a thing. It's an evolved, it's a concept that speaks to an evolving relationship, namely the divorcement of the producer from the means of production. That's a historical evolving process. So the proletariat evolved historically. So I think it's appropriate to talk about the proletariat of 1830, the proletariat of 1840. The proletariat concept is a flexible and a viable one throughout history. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Marx here seems to be writing history as it unfolds realistically, not in terms of trying to fit history into the requirements of a particular theory. I don't see that.
Sure, thanks. Okay, any other comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly, I mean, the proletariat couldn't have been represented in the National Assembly, right? Because they didn't have the vote. So they didn't get universal suffrage till after that. And what happened was that the reason you got a republic was that Raspail went down to the National Assembly and said, "You'll give us a republic, I'll have 200,000 people down here in the next hour." And so they got the republic because they're a social force in motion, right? That, whoever's the man there was one other worker and Louis Blanc, sort of representing the bourgeoisie. But yeah, you're right in the sense that it's not a formal representation. But then Raspail wasn't an elected leader either, but he was able to act on behalf of the social force in motion, is how I would say it. And of course, then they had to, like Blanc had this idea of social workshops, but but they said, "Oh, well, again," I thought it was all pretty familiar, because it was like, "Oh, okay, yes, that's very important. We need to do something for the workers. Here, you can have a whole commission. Go down to the palace there, and you work it all out down there, and let us know how you get on." And in the meantime, of course, the actual people with power, the ministries, are busy organising, things. And in fact, they were cleverly able to say, "Here, we've got these workshops, these national workshops, which are like English workhouses, right?" Nothing like what, Blanc had envisaged. But of course, then they could say, "Oh, well, this was Blanc's idea. He's been down working it out. And here we have socialism. This is what it's going to look like, guys." So it was a clever, process of maneuvering on their part. I didn't make a note in here, but I didn't quite catch who you were talking about, Jeff, when you mentioned that journalist or writer that you started with, the Weberian, I think you said.
I answered it. I sent you an answer on the chat.
Oh, okay, there. Okay, thanks for that. I'll have a look.
Right, I'll take George next, just because he hasn't spoken yet, and then John.
I would like to say that
we've done the first hour, so let's just be conscious of the time.
Okay, I'll stop my slides, but I'd like just to say quickly that in Marx, the dominant form of representation is ideological representation. That means that the representative shouldn't necessarily come from the social class that he or she will represent. Okay. As is the case with Marx himself. He represents the interests of emancipation of the working class, though he comes from the bourgeois class in terms of class position and class upbringing. Actually, he discusses this issue of ideological representation in the very section that we are studying right now. And he will become even more explicit in the 18th Brumaire about how we have ideological representation. And it is important also that within ideological representation, we have also the construction of illusions concerning the interests of a class, which is important because the leader, a revolutionary leader, may be disillusioned about how to represent or whether he represents the actual interests of the social class he claims to represent. Okay. Which is a very important thing that Marx discusses actually from the preamble in the class triangle, which is the idea of political illusions. Perhaps we will have a chance to discuss it in the next section, how political illusions are constituted.
Okay. Sure, thanks. Yeah, John.
Yeah, just a purely academic point, really. I think it was Blanqui who coined the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat. I would be interested to know where Jeff was found that that view is contradicted. Blanqui also introduced the idea of the Industrial Revolution as well. Though pointing out in the 1830s that England has gone through an industrial revolution as profound as the French Revolution, which is where the phrase comes from. Before Disraeli invented the phrase "workshop of the world," though it wasn't Blanqui who coined the term workers' state, that was in fact Bakunin. But anyway, I'm not sure that takes us anything I've said takes us any further. So I'll move on.
I'll write to you, John, about Blanqui in the chat now.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to George. Just another kind of the origin of dictatorship of the proletariat as a term is very interesting. But also, I think you need to remember the Russian aspect. Why is it so prominent in our discussions? Because Plekhanov insisted it was in the maximum program of the RSDLP. So although Marx, drawing from Blanqui, certainly used it, obviously in the critique of the Gotha program and other places like that, it was Plekhanov really who made it famous, because then Plekhanov put it in the maximum program of the RSDLP, and then obviously Lenin and whatnot picked it up from Plekhanov. Anyway, there you go.
So we just, I was reading it, but yeah, I just put it in the chat too. Babeuf is the other player in the discussion. He had terms like dictatorship of the equals and dictatorship of the people and stuff. Just be aware that Liz has got a couple of slides, so we need make time for her at the end. So just be aware of that.
Okay, I'll try to be as quick as possible. We discussed the previous week that not all dates in the historical chronology are historical date. Marx organizes his presentation of the analysis of the revolutionary period according to historical date. Now, historical dates are defined by historical events. And what can be an event? Are all events happening in history, let's say, equivalent to each other? We can define an event as a constellation of incidents. But which incidents enter the constellation that constitutes an event? This is a question unsolved without being outside the tribunal of reason. By tribunal of reason, I mean what Jeff suggested, that it is impossible to analyze history without having a theoretical framework, a rational theory that connects events with each other, understands what an event is, how they are connected, and whether and provides hypotheses about social causation between events and processes and phenomena. And I'll give some examples why Marx, how Marx is doing that. Plus, I would also slightly disagree with the idea that Marx is describing historical conjecture or historical phenomena. He's analyzing, goes beyond the facade of historical phenomena in order to unearth, to discover and present the class forces that operate and clash with each other and constitute what appears as a revolutionary situation. Now, it is a reason that assigns the historical significance to the incidents that contribute meaningfulness to an event. For instance, let's take the case of a monarchical ruler of a state. He does 3 acts on the same day. He brushes his teeth, he copulates with his mistress, and he proclaims war against another country. do these acts have the same significance history-wide? Perhaps one could argue that an act's significance depends on the object domain of the historical investigation. If it is focused on the personal history of the ruler, on his biography, not washing his teeth may lead to unhealthy consequences that lead to a premature death and thus initiate a war of succession that pits royal houses against each other with disastrous effects upon the people subjected to them. So perhaps an insignificant event and action taking place in a given day may have such adversive consequences that may lead to the creation of historical catastrophe in the future. Or we have the so-called Pascal's argument concerning Cleopatra's nose. For those who may not have heard, Pascal is a French philosopher of the 16th century who made a very important argument that if the nose of Cleopatra was different and she was not so attractive, it wouldn't have elicited the campaign by the Roman Caesar to achieve conquest over Carthage, the so-called Northern Africa expedition, which resulted to very adversive effects and to its possible loss of the emperor position. Anyway, if the object of study is political history, then the declaration of war attains its special significance as an event crucial for the contemporary state of affairs. Even the distinction of object domains, let's say personal history, political history, economic history, cultural history, social history, presupposes theoretical reason to demarcate them, to demarcate the domains of applying historical analysis and theorize their independence or, on the contrary, their interdependence, because we have two different strands of historical analysis. One that says that the domains themselves are relatively autonomous from each other, so you can have a kind of history of the development of the domain regardless of whatever happens to the other domains. And there is another historical strand, which is that historical materialism is based upon, that says all domains are interdependent and there are codetermination relations among the different domains. Lastly, reason is fundamental in the evaluation of history and its events, both epistemologically and ethically. Without reason, there is no possibility of further judging that there are injustices committed in history. Now, apart from repetition of events and of kinds of events, we also have a dialectic. Repetition of events may carry with it novel elements that develop the situation, the establishment of a reproduction process in its unfolding. For instance, we may have social processes that take place in history, shaping history instead of being shaped by it. And I mean, in the second sense, in the sense of operating beyond the historical contingencies and contextual particularities. In other words, we can have social processes which are general in character and they are not dependent on historical contingencies and ephemeral shifts in terms of events happening. This is the case, for example, of the capitalist production process. For instance, its aspect of the form of development of the technical division of labor, which also has a typical character. It is one similar or identical pattern of technical change and social form transformation of production relations. For example, Taylorism, the assembly line, lean production, just-in-time production, just-in-case production, the building stages of needed materials, the importance that critical raw materials have obtained today with the growing computerization of industrial production. All these are essential features of the technical division of labor consonant with the inner development of the capitalist mode of production. They are manifested in history, they are not dependent on particular historical contingencies. It is the social logic of capitalist productive development that has brought the need of critical materials into prominence, not the evolution of history per se. These form transformations have a universal character that it is embodied in the myriad particular instances of capital formation. Another example of such universalistic process is the process of urbanization. And we have seen in let's say, in the Directrice and in later texts, how Marx discusses the process of urbanization as a universal process. How? You have to unmute yourself, Howard.
Yes, there. Okay. Could you make your point about, go over that again, the whole thing about form transformation? Just, I'd love to hear that argument again.
Okay. The changes in the technical division of labor, which is a fundamental internal characteristic of the development of the capitalist mode of production, involves changes in form. Okay. The introduction, let's say, of the assembly line changes the form of organized of the organized relation of production. So this is the idea. The idea is that we have a social process in history that registers the different changes in form in the way relations of production are organized, and this is manifested in the very particular and multiple capital units that organize the production process according to these changing forms of the technical division of labor. But my argument is that it is not history itself as something independent of the social process of capitalist development of the mode of production that affects the capitalist mode of production, but it is its inner social logic as a process that it is manifested in history. Okay. So the capitalist mode of production shapes history. It is not shaped by it. Now, another important distinction is that between diachronic structures of temporal sequence of events, like revolutions. Revolutions are not momentary events taking place in a limited time period, but they have duration. Okay, so they have a diachronic character. But this kind of historical temporality of a diachronic structure expressed in temporal sequences of events is different from longer-term historical structures, which are exhibited and operate within history. So the first case of diachronic temporality of a structure may refer to a revolution, and as we see, and it is, let me make the point here, actually, the revolutions are combined in a kind of historical series, or if you like, in a social logic of connection one with another. Jeff mentioned the French Revolution, which is important, and it is constitutive, but also Marx starts the analysis, the discussion of the class struggles in 1848 by presenting an analysis of the July monarchy. The July monarchy is the constitutive condition that initiates the whole process of the revolution a few years later on, as he says. We will discuss. I'll discuss the quote later. Okay. Now, let me go into the text. In the first section, Marx discusses how the defeat of the June Revolution ought to be the eye-opening event for what a true proletarian revolution's aim is for the proletariat. Actually, it is the defeat that opens the eye of the proletariat, and it's representative in terms of what it means to have a proletarian revolution. It's not a success. It is like saying that we learn from our mistakes, not from our successes. Okay. The February Revolution, won by the proletariat, was in fact a successful bourgeois revolution against the monarchy and the financial aristocracy and the bankocracy. It is interesting that Marx uses this term, which is a neologism, that effectively held political power. This introduces the issue of political illusions, under which various social classes misrecognize their interests and fight their wrong battles. In other words, the working class fought for a revolution for the sake of the bourgeoisie, or at least first in June 1830 for the sake of the bourgeois monarchy, to establish the bourgeois monarchy, and in 1848 for the sake of the industrial bourgeoisie and the bourgeois republic. Okay. Here the battle was conducted under the rubric of the people, brotherhood among citizens instead of class identity. The revolutionary leaders themselves were deluded in their aims. The main social cause for the misguiding espousal of illusions was the undeveloped social form of the proletariat, being a consequence of an undeveloped industrial bourgeoisie. In other words, if you don't have the social development of the capitalist mode of production, and that means the development of productive capital, okay, this is the industrial bourgeoisie, you cannot have the development also of the proletariat, the generalization of the wage labor form. Okay. At that period in France, the numerical size of the proletariat was minimal. Basically, skilled craftsmen and handicraft workers in manufacture, at the manufacturing stage of capitalist development, like, were on the stage. Now, Marx's analysis is based on the class constitution of French society. There are certain classes whose mobilizations, reactions, and alliances define the specificity of capital. Of importance is that these classes are divided due to different and opposing interests. The main class, the bourgeoisie, is divided into factions, one of which has exclusive political power and legislates for itself to the detriment of the whole society. The financial aristocracy, the bankocracy, that has the privilege to control public and private credit. The politically excluded industrial bourgeoisie suffers from the dominance of the financial aristocracy. Now, this is important. In what sense? This is what Marx later will develop in the theories of surplus value as the internal opposition within capital between interest-bearing capital and productive capital. He says that the opposition between interest-bearing capital and productive capital that generates profit as surplus value is constitutive of capital itself. It is an inner essential self-division of capital. And we see that before the writings of 1863-62, that Marx wrote this analysis of the internal composition of capital into interest-bearing and productive capital, we see also the political expression of this class expressed in the revolutionary struggle of 1848. It was not the French bourgeoisie, I think Bill has presented that the other time, this quote. So I'll just read the last paragraph. The opening statement in the preamble of the article written by Marx states the theoretical conclusion that he has arrived in evaluating the July 1830 revolution. So this is not journalism. This is historical analysis, socio-historical analysis. In journalism, you start by presenting the facts. And then if you want to draw some conclusions, you do it by the end. Here we have an exactly different mode of presentation. It starts with a theoretical conclusion, and I will connect that to Hegel's mode of presentation later on. So he posits the theoretical conclusion that he has arrived in evaluating the July 1830 revolution, and conclusion that is the presupposition to explain the evolution and outcome of 1848 revolution in France. Now, the July 1830 revolution assigned and consolidated the position of supreme political power not to and by the bourgeoisie as a whole, but by a faction of the bourgeoisie, the financial aristocracy. Marx becomes even more specific by pinpointing certain forms of capital ownership that constituted the reigning bloc of a segment of the bourgeoisie. It doesn't just say the financial aristocracy as a segment or as a bloc or as a segment of the bourgeoisie took power and ruled autocratically. He says the particular elements, among which, for example, is extractive ownership, bourgeois ownership or landowners ownership of extractive industries and mines and things like that. So this ruling bloc imposed its own particular interests on the state. My question, I want to raise a question that perhaps we can discuss it in the future. Can we enumerate which forms or capitalist groups from the bloc form the bloc or function of the US bourgeoisie that ascended political power via the victory of the Trumpian-led Republican Party? Or is the Trump presidency representative politically of the whole US bourgeoisie, or perhaps representative of the native working class, as Trump himself has claimed time and again? I think Marx's analysis gives us an opportunity to raise this kind of question. Is the whole US bourgeoisie represented with the Trumpian accession to power, or just a bloc? And which factions of capital form this bloc? This is important because, as we will see and as we have seen, there are hostile interests into this kind of alliances. And this is very important to see which blocks of capital are excluded from a possible alliance and ascendance to political power that could be also a case for overturning or changing this class alliance having taken power in the US. Now,
just keep an eye on the time, George. We've got
okay.
It's 25-2, and I'd like to give Liz 15 at least.
Okay. Let me.
George.
Yes.
I had my hand up. I got a question on a point you made earlier.
Go ahead. Yes, Willie.
Yeah. Well, my question, you pointed to the question of the political illusion, particularly in talking about 1830. But I think my view is that where there's an illusion, there's also an element of reality. In this case, we're talking about that it was real that a certain fraction of the bourgeoisie did have the power, and history did accord it rising to ascendancy of power. On the other hand, that power was illusory as things developed further, because the real power, that is the power on side of history in the industrial bourgeoisie, occupied at that point in history a minority or the loyal opposition or whatever. So I think along with the question of the idea of political illusion, we always have to keep an eye on the fact that there is that element of reality. Secondarily, I think the same thing is operative in the question here in the United States of Trump. I think there is an illusion among many that Trump represents the totality of the bourgeoisie, but there is ample evidence that that's not true, that his presidency, his ascendancy represents a very reactionary element within the bourgeoisie, and it's a task to identify those elements as Marx did in that second paragraph of part one. But that's my point. My main point was that I think that in talking about the question of illusion, we have to look at the reality upon which those illusions are created in history.
Okay, I agree with your viewpoint, but I didn't want to express my own. I just wanted to raise the question for discussion, possible discussion and expression of various opinions on that. Jeff, please unmute yourself. Jeff, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Jeff. Jeff, unmute.
It's just an important point because Cynthia was saying that she found it impossible to hear without captions, which is why these texts that you're putting up are so important for deaf people. What I've done is to write very brief comments in the chat rather than interfering in your discussion. So I'm just alerting people that there are comments in the chat which can be read as opposed to listened to, which I understand Cynthia's point very much, but it's clearer when you read it.
Okay. Okay, let me just pick up a point from the second paragraph. Marx calls the rule of the financial aristocracy an autocracy. It is an autocratic form of rule. Okay. This is important because autocracy means that we have a political form of power which is unrestrained in its expression of political will. In other words, they achieve total control of political power. As he says, they control the helms of state power. They decided all legislative policies and the laws enacted. They appointed all personnel to positions of power. And appointment means loyalists and cronies. Okay. Servants, if you like, of the political power in the ministries and the public offices. And sat at the throne, meaning the ruler of the regime, financial aristocrat, sat at the throne, and that means that the ruler of the regime was a surrogate puppet of the bloc of this bloc of the ruling class. Okay. It is the political representative that takes stage up front, but represents this particular class bloc. Now, what was excluded from a share in this autocratic power was the industrial bourgeoisie, okay, which retained or held a weak place in parliament. It follows that its interests were disregarded, as Marx says. This split between financial, monetary capital and industrial capital, as we have seen in the theories of surplus value, is an internal division in capital's essence and pits one form against the other and expresses a form, and that's important, it's a category that's not often used in Marxist theory, expresses an intra-class struggle. So we don't have struggle. Class struggle is not just struggle between classes. You can have struggles within classes. Okay. And here we have a form of intra-class struggle. Classes, or we have also classes with landowners. And this is a case that we had in the English Parliament in the 18th century and so on. Classes now with landowners are not intra-class, since landowners constitute a separate class than the capitalist bourgeoisie. That's explicitly stated and analyzed in the theories of surplus value. Of course, if in the development of the capitalist mode of production, landowners are transformed into real estate capital, then their class basis shifts and enter the bourgeois class. but still the class of their own particular interests remains. And so they are a force of opposition against, in particular, productive capital. Okay, I skipped the first quote. We've seen that the other classes were excluded from participation or representation in possession or in possession or influence of political power. Everyone, including their ideological representatives, were excluded from representation. This is important because ideological representation is the dominant norm through which social classes participate in parliamentary affairs, either individually or in party formation. Political parties, in other words, represent ideologically the class interests of different social strata. Okay, I say something about Trump, but it doesn't matter. Ideological representation is a mediating layer of expression and transmission of classes' will in the chambers of political decision-making processes and effectuates the appropriate masquerading of particularistic interests into deluding general interests. In other words, the ideological representation has the tendency to take up particularistic or particular interests and present them as general interests, as the interests of the whole society. For example, in the name of the people, you have the ideological representation of the interest of a specific, of a particular class, or in the name of a class, you may have the ideological representation of particular sections of it. Like, for example, in both the Democratic and the Republican parties' ideological manifesto that say that we represent the interests of the middle class or even the working class. So they don't say that we represent the interests of the whole class, but we represent the particular interests of particular segment of social classes in the US. Right? Nevertheless, this is presented as a kind of general form of interest.
We could go down to quarter two, George.
Okay.
So
I have just two
just one minute,
slides, two methodological remarks now. First, in his mode of presentation, Marx follows the Hegelian method of starting with the already derived result of the investigative research. Here, it is the outcome of the type of class rule and faction, autocracy and financial aristocracy that has obtained political power in the 1830 revolution. Second, Marx does not do any kind of historical analysis, but he presupposes a definite theoretical conceptualization of the French class structure and focuses on the sociopolitical forces that determine the constellation of the historical revolutionary situation. He does not describe historical events as such, but analyzes the social entanglement of class groups and the impact of certain socio-historical, economic, and ideological conditions and events on the evolution of class struggle. And let me very quickly give you a reasoning of the social possession that Marx presents in his analysis. Sorry, give me just half a second. Sorry. Okay, let me finish with my last, and I'll present it, my last slide. Now, owing to its financial straits, Marx says the July monarchy was dependent from the beginning on the big bourgeoisie, and its dependence on the big bourgeoisie was the inexhaustible source of increasing financial strains. Now, we have a dialect.
George, can we sum it up? I just want to give Liz some time. Since she's asked to present, we're nearly 10-2, so, you know.
Okay, just 2 minutes. We have a dialectic of dependence. The regime was dependent on the big bourgeoisie, the bureaucracy, or finance capital that financed the public debt of the state. The mode of financing was such that it deepened the financial dependency rather than alleviate. So this is something, this kind of vicious circle of debtocracy, which is important because a lot of nation states in our contemporary world are they are dependent on huge public debts that reproduce this kind of dialectic of dependency by borrowing ever more money in order to pay off previous debts and so on. And we have a global increase in the size of public debt throughout. Also, another thing that is very important concerns what Marx says about the balancing the budget. Okay, he says that in order to promote national production, you have to balance the budget. Now, the increase of national production is the general interest of society. And a state needs to have a balanced budget. But a balanced budget ensures simple reproduction of a society and a certain social stability. But the fact that the budget was unbalanced, and due to the dialectic of debt dependency, it needed to increase taxation, but increased taxation harms the very interests of the class fraction that support the political regime in power. Okay. So you have a logic, a dialectical logic of taking action, necessary actions on the part of the state or of political power, having control of the state, that result in unintended negative consequences that lead to the overturning of political power itself. It's a kind of entanglement in necessary contradiction.
Yes, yes.
So
Okay.
we see also how contradictions are important for this kind of dialectic of overturning an existing policy or rule of a given form of political power.
You can finish off next week, George, if you like, but I really just want to give Liz some time. So can you can do that next week? Well, and Liz, can you put your slides up?
Oh, no, I thought you were going to do it. I haven't got them ready to put up. I don't even know how to do that.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, is that okay? Sorry, I thought you were going to do it. I thought you did everyone. Sorry.
No, I send them out, but I
Or just send my couple of slides out to the general.
Everybody see that?
Yeah.
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 Can you go to the one below? Thanks. So I think Marx has come from his early writings, and he's trying to present his materialist method. Marx's double test, Engels says, is using facts to prove that political events or history have economic causes. So Marx's double test was, I think, in the first place, the revolution, in the second place, counter-revolution. And Marx's causal connection between event, which is in the middle column, and economic situation in the first, reveals that those events turn out to be class antagonisms, emerging as a historical process of class struggles. So that changes in economic development is the basis of Marx's historical. So you can see the economic causes, the world trade crisis. So the credit to railways is frozen because of the potato blight. So bullion's taken out to pay for food because of the famine, and that freezes credit. There's no liquidity, so trade ends. I think at some point the French were paying 90% of their wages, the French poor, on bread, and the French debt was half of GDP. So we've got the event, which is that the constitutional monarchy has limited suffrage, and there's agitation at the banquets for increased participation in government. The social vehicles of agency, if we're thinking in terms of Hegelian will, which has to be externalized in order for it to be sort of real and not just fancied, a government, press, and army. Those are kind of the vehicles. So the antagonism that this first situation in France in February reveals is that there's an antagonism between finance capital and industrial capital. So Marx says a compromise between, so there's just like a compromise between the different classes which together overturned the July throne, whose interests were antagonistic. So this economic crisis reveals these antagonistic forces between finance capitalists, which galvanized the political interests of the industrial bourgeoisie for representation, but also the petty bourgeoisie and the hungry poor. Okay, and then the next slide. I should have done a third slide, but I just didn't have time. So you have the same cause, economic cause, which is the devastation of trade and industry. And I think Shane has said how it impacted on the petty bourgeoisie, where because foreign trade had dried up, the bourgeois manufacturers, so our industrial bourgeoisie, turned to supply domestic markets, throwing the petty bourgeoisie into bankruptcy. What Bill has said, the passing on of state debt to the embittered petty bourgeoisie and sale of debt, which I think the bourgeoisie, there's something Marx says about the bullion again, where debt is traded in, and there's a sort of crisis in the banks, and the government, instead of abolishing the bank, like Bill said, underwrites it, and I think they choose to pay off the debt early, which they shouldn't have done, because they're just underwriting state assets. If it was a real bourgeois, if it was a real proletariat revolution, they wouldn't have done that. They'd have just had a national bank. So what does that cause? That the manufacturing, the industrial bourgeoisie declare provisional government. I have to like go through this really quickly. And it's the universal suffrage. Now, I think what Marx extracts from this is that universal suffrage is the terrain upon which emancipation can be won, but not emancipation itself. So you can vote now for a workers' party, but that doesn't mean to say that there's a workers' party in place to vote for, because obviously there's government, but there's no sort of like workers' party. And Marx makes this point elsewhere about the Jewish question and about the American Revolution, which was you're entitled to vote in America, but the property relation makes that impossible because they don't have property. The right to work is enmeshed. So you have the enmeshed goals of the proletariat and the industrial bourgeoisie in the Republic, because the right to work's enmeshed in bourgeois terms. So it's not, if you're thinking of Hegelian will as a sort of agency, the form in which it's represented is not cohesive. There's slippage in between form and content. So you've got the right content, but the wrong form. But the other thing that Marx extracts here is this territory of this, the crux of it, this antagonism, is applicable to internationally to all working class people, because it's the antagonism of the workers against the bourgeoisie. But at least it's been brought into view. Yes, it's no longer hiding behind the crown. It's no longer a battle between serfs and landlord, royalty. It's a battle between the industrial bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and this is the real sort of result of this crisis. That's it.
Liz, if you wouldn't mind recapitulating, restating the overview that you gave in the introduction.
Yeah, sure thing. If you go, yeah. So Marx is basically saying that history comes not from like great men like Bonaparte or Bismarck. It comes from the economy. And the economy has a crisis which reveals events like the events of February 1848. And these are expressions of class-based antagonisms, and each invoking its own will and fighting for representation is what history turns out to be. That's what the economic crises bring into view. The sort of, I don't want to say dialectic, but like the crises allow territory to emerge, that is struggle between classes for representation, for owning the economy, for representing its own interests. He talks somewhere about minorities claiming to represent the whole, but really only the proletariat can represent the whole. And that homogenous kind of republic is due to these alliances, which have been illustrated. But further crises and further economic issues, problems, debt, and so on, separate out the classes. So you could look at it in terms of productive negation, in terms of content and form, if you wanted to be Hegelian about it, where by separating itself through struggle, the proletariat recognized that its interests have been, it's a productive negation because their interests have not been realized in the form of the republic or the government of the bourgeoisie.
Jane, could we get a hard copy of Leah's slides?
Say that again, Wayne?
Can we get a hard copy of your slides?
Yeah, I think Shane can get them out. The third one missing, I just didn't have time to do it because I've got some other stuff I've got to prep for.
Yeah, they'll go out as usual, Ronnie. Yeah.
Yeah, I just can't enlarge, my vision thing. That's what makes that appeal.
Yep. Jeff.
Thank you. Beautiful discussion.
Just on this point about politics and economics, I mean, it brings to mind a letter that Engels wrote to Bloch in 1890, where he specifically refers to these writings of class struggles in France, etc. And there he says that Marx had never reduced all events to economic causes. And that economics is certainly an important part. Everyone recognizes that. But to say that everything is caused by economic events is far too primitive. And
but the economic event forces into the open the interest and will of antagonistic social sectors, classes.
It can certainly have a big impact on the crisis.
Without the economic crises, I'm not sure whether the bourgeoisie in the first instance would have gone against the finance aristocracy, or the money capitalists, the speculators.
Without economic crisis, I don't think that would be need for a working class movement. But the fact is that it's economic crisis as such is certainly a very important factor. Marx talks about it. But what Engels calls a parallelogram of forces develops as a result, which it sounds as though you're saying the same thing as you, but in a different way. Rather, Engels is saying the same thing as you, but in a different way, which is that political and all sorts of other factors are mobilized, certainly, but economic crises don't necessarily lead to revolutions. Britain had a terrible economic crisis in the 1830s, which led to an attempt at a general strike, but there was nothing which actually led to a revolution. But no one doubts that the economic crisis, I'm not saying the economic crisis is not a very big effect here.
Yeah, I think it drives into light the antagonisms between interests, and then from there, I think the vehicles of agency weren't really as available to the proletariat, because the bourgeois industrialists dominated so much in the areas of government, press, and army. In this case, it was only when the proletariat used force in that threat at the Hotel de Ville that they made gains. The proletariat made gains.
Remember that that's often when economic crises have played themselves out, but political revolutions can occur. It's not a straight thing. It's the American
Marx was trying.
Fascinating for that, and particularly for showing the conflict between credit and debtors, which dominated a lot of the debates in America. And it wasn't as simple as you might think. It's a fascinating, complex event.
We're going to have to return to this next week, guys, because we are running over.
Yeah, I'm conscious of that, Bill. Okay, John's pulled his hand out.
Thank you.
So we've got the second.
Thank you, Liz. It's nice to hear a different voice. And
yes, very good. We appreciate it.